Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of Old Scribes. Here with my partner in crime, George Willis, who's enjoying the, well, not so sunny Florida, while I freeze here in Chicago. And speaking of Chicago, I got a native son here who everybody knows. Like to welcome the former ESPN great, the former Showtime great, Sam Taub Award winner, and International Boxing Hall of Fame inductee back in 2012, and now working with DAZN with Big Time USA Boxing Series. Al Bernstein, thank you very much for joining us here today. We know you're ultra busy as always.
Good to be with you guys. Nice to see both of you.
Yeah. And first off, I got to ask you, Al, how you feel about Ben Johnson?
I am ecstatic. Listen, Bears fans have always lower expectations of everything, whether it's coaches or quarterbacks or anything. But it seems like a good hire, no?
Well, it kind of seemed like they got it right. Yeah, I mean, for after years of not,
yeah,
kind of seems like they got it right.
They seem to have. So, I hope that's a harbinger of things to come. They always say you can't change unless you change ownership. Sometimes things don't change.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's not been the greatest, but we'll see. I hope Ben Johnson can make it work.
Yes, absolutely.
I think he was like the guy, I guess the number one candidate out there, right, in my opinion. And plus, you got the quarterback in place and Caleb that he can work with and build the offense around. So, he's got a good shot. He picked his spot because he could have gone anywhere. And he picked Chicago. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting point. So he made the selection, so he must feel based on they weren't just doing evaluating, so was he, right? Because he had all these people as suitors, so he was evaluating where should I go. So, and in addition to Caleb Williams, the Bears they do have a lot of offensive weapons there, so we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
Only thing we don't have a dome here in Chicago.
Pardon?
We don't have a dome here in Chicago.
Yeah, no. Yeah, there should be one, I think. But.
Right, there could be one soon. Let's talk a little about boxing. I mean, right now we're, you've been in the sport for, 4 or 5 decades, Al, and this may be one of the more interesting times the sport has seen. What do you make of this kind of boxing scene right now with, a lot of emerging stars? You got Turkey and Saudi Arabia maybe making some noise, starting a league. What do you think of these times in boxing? These
are interesting times. Boxing often, and you and George know this very well from covering the sport for years, we say it's a time of passage because sometimes it is, right? And new things happen. It's funny. I'm just in the process of writing a column for Ring Magazine, which I need to finish in 2 days, and I'm writing it about how now one of the things that's changing in boxing is the way it's delivered to people. Of course, we know all the things in boxing that are change, like the fighters and who the champions are and how many champions there are and all the rest of it. But one of the things that right now it is changing is the platform. When I came in to boxing in 1980, it was the best of all worlds because they had free TV in America. Now this is America centric, not worldwide, but we'll get to the worldwide thing. But they had boxing on the over-the-air networks. We were starting with ESPN and USA Boxing, which was boxing on cable, which was brand new to the United States. And then as he's moved on, we saw the addition of the premium cable channels. So all that was in the 80s. And it was the perfect way for boxing delivered in the United States. That changed. ESPN, they stayed with the boxing, whatever, but it went off the over-the-air network, and all the big fights ended up on the premium pay channels. For those of us, and I went to show, in the 2000s, and for people at the premium channels, it was great. But let's be honest, it diminished a little bit the audience for boxing. Not everyone had those paid channels. All right, fast forward to now, where boxing is going through another change, both internationally and in the United States. In the United States, there's one outlet left boxing on terrestrial TV of some kind, and that's it. There are talks about that they may scale back dramatically or not do any boxing. So it becomes a real issue for the sport because now it's going digital, and that means DAZN. It means possibly Netflix. People already aligned with Prime Video, though they haven't really done any shows just on Prime Video. So the way boxing is being delivered definitely changes sports fans.
So Al, yeah, you brought up an interesting point in that boxing, when it did start going to cable, when it started getting off of network TV, the audience certainly diminished a little bit, and for many years, and it seems to have diminished ever since. Is it going to be difficult for this sport to it almost has to start all over? In some places, there's guys that are 50 and over that may know guys like Boom Boom Mancini, but anyone younger may not know, and it's almost like the sport has to start all over again.
Well, boxing's big problem, in my opinion, came, and you guys understand this part, not just from the platforms, but from the fact that boxing was undercovered. It was not covered in newspapers, diminished, of course, and their impact. Then it wasn't covered on TV a lot, and so the sport hasn't gotten the coverage for the fighters to be as famous as they should be, and that's compounded by the fact that people have to find the actual sport itself. They have to at least somewhat deeply, capable to find sport, whether it's on a DAZN or it's on, they have, getting a prescription to Prime, which of course most people do. A lot of people have subscriptions to some streamer at this point, no matter what. And so, yeah, there are challenges that the sport faces. Now, on the other hand, all sports are headed toward digital imprints at some point.
Yeah.
Kind of being pushed into getting a head start on it, in the United States at least, not so much in all the other countries, but boxing has been to the digital side. They're going to, I did an interview with Mark Taffet recently, which he was talking about that. And he said, he's a little optimistic. Boxing will make things work on the digital side, and that's where sports is going anyway.
I think one of the things they need to do to make things work is just to make more fights and better fights. I think fans are accustomed to watching things on the platforms now. They're watching the NFL on Amazon and Peacock and Netflix. So I think the sports fan has gotten used to searching a little bit for events. So you have to make them want to engage in these events. Now, obviously, from what we saw with Tyson and Paul, fans will tune in to combat sports if they have a reason. This was kind of a show on its own, but it just proves that they're out there, and you just have to find a way to reach them and engage them. And this off and on about who's fighting who and are they going to fight? The fight's on, and no, it's off, and this and that. I don't think that helps at all with anything.
Well, here's the thing. Okay, I'm of the belief that the boxing calendar the last couple of years has been fairly good.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect, but good.
Yeah.
And this year, we see, with the influence, especially which that you alluded to, of the Turkey and the Saudi people, which we can debate for 3 hours on whether it's good or bad or whatever. But the one thing about it is creating really good fights. Now, some of those feel, and there's a different problem for this. If you get too many pay-per-views, clearly. So fans need something that they can sink their teeth into, where they can watch a bunch of fights without paying individually for the fights.
Mhm.
Zone does that per month, right? They give a lot of boxing. Netflix has yet to make a program. Amazon Prime has put maybe one, possibly two fights on its actual service. The rest have been pay-per-views. So it isn't for lack of good fights. It's whether people have to pay extra for them. Because, I mean, the rest of this year has the schedule in February for boxing is absurdly good. I mean, it's one of the best I've seen. So I think they're capable now of making fights that they haven't always made. I thought last year wasn't that terrible, but they two things: to make the good fights, and fans have to know about them, and that's where coverage of boxing comes into play too.
Mm-hmm. I remember, when I first started covering boxing, and you go to a fight in Vegas, and all the big newspapers were there from Chicago and Dallas, and the West Coast and Atlanta, and all these newspapers were there. And 7 years later, they were nowhere to be seen at fights. And a part of that was the industry changed, and I think a lot of editors trying to cut back on budget. Pinpointed boxing is a travel expense they didn't really need anymore. So that sort of trickled down to what you're talking about. It's not being covered as heavily anymore, and it became basically an online sport to find out the information you needed.
Right. That's exactly. And I was at ESPN in the 90s and 2000s, and I couldn't get SportsCenter to do anything on other than occasionally covering the big fights. I couldn't ever talk them into doing anything that was a feature or a something that just because fans are interested in it, they just didn't want to do it. And of course, here's the funny thing: during that period, they didn't have they had the one boxing on Friday night, and they felt that covered it. But then when they started doing bigger fights, they did that next contract after their Friday night fight series kind of went away. Then all of a sudden they got covering boxing. Why? Because they had the boxing product on with bigger fights. So their editorial judgment, because the product, which happens as well.
Yeah.
So Al, with whatever happens with boxing going to Saudi Arabia, and it looks like a lot of it will end up there. What do you think that means for boxing in the United States? Where the amateur program certainly isn't what it used to be. And as a result of that, a lot of these cities where like used to have Pernell Whitaker and Norfolk and Virgil Hill and Bismarck and Orlando Canizales and Laredo. Now that doesn't seem to exist anymore. That was years ago. But what do you think that means for boxing in the U.S. if a great percentage of the big fights go abroad?
Well, I think that some of the big fights are clearly going to go there. We still see fights where, like, they put Boots Ennis in Philadelphia. They had a couple of fights out in L.A. that were good fight on a top, not pay-per-view level, but a really good level. And we still see it. It's just that these super big fights, if the Saudis are putting all this money into it, they want to have the fights, but the big ones, the real big ones. And what effect that will the positive impact of it is that people do get to see these people fight. I mean, we saw Better Be Evan. We've got this card on February 22nd that is staggeringly good. 7 great. And I don't think, for instance, Frank Warren is lined up with his own, and that's his only distributor now. He's not even doing boxing in the UK on other pay channels or other premium channels. And I know he's going to bring fights in the United States. He will have fights here that they'll be showing on his own. That what ones there will be, I don't know. So, and of course, Top Rank and the PBC, which is trying to find its way through current TV situation, they're going to continue to do fights in the United States. Even the Saudis, Turkey, and those, they're going to try and place strategically fights in the United States because you understand for that market there has to be something here. So I don't think boxing I don't think there's a danger of it disappearing. It's just a question of everybody making sure that enough of them happen in the locations where the fighters are, and states in general. That. I mean, this next weekend's a perfect example. We have Benavidez and Morrell here in Los Angeles. It's a really terrific fight and a good card, and everybody here is excited about it.
Quick question about that. Speaking of Benavidez and Morrell, number one, who do you like in that fight? I mean, and number two, I mean, is the winner just never going to get Canelo?
Yeah. Yeah. But, I if put a gun to my head and said you have to make a prediction, I would lean to Benavidez because he's got more experience against better fighters in the grand scheme of things, and he's an offensive machine, even though he's not beatable, obviously, and he's not a one person, but I think he has a little more experience and a little more experience against top fighters. Now, as to which doesn't discount the idea of winning that fight, he could certainly do it, and I think it's going to be a really entertaining and interesting fight. Yep. Now they both moved up to 175 for this fight, so they're both now kind of officially at 175. They could come back to 168. I don't think Canelo has any interest in David Benavidez. I don't think he's had any interest.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty confident that he is never going to fight David Benavidez. Now, whether he would fight Morrell, I don't know. But I think their prize at the end of the day will be in the light heavyweight division. Maybe one of them could fight the winner of Bivol Beterbiev, which we have coming up, and maybe then creating themselves as light heavyweight champions.
And what does that mean for Canelo's legacy? I mean, to mention someone that he has no interest in fighting, that's not something we heard about Oscar De La Hoya and people like that. When they used to Sugar Shea Mosley, they fought everybody, and Hopkins and all of them, and to have at such a time where the sports really needs something like that, to push itself along, to not have that happen. And I mean, what's that going to do for Canelo's legacy when you think back?
His counter to that, that's a fair statement. His counter to that would be look at my resume. Fought everybody just about. I mean, I have all these champions, various weight classes that I've fought, all major fights. Even willing to jump in with Mayweather probably before I was ready. All that. He'd go do all kinds of historical looking at things. And then he would probably also say that, oh, well, look, I'm going to make a great fight against Terrence Crawford. It's going to be a monstrous fight. It's going to be big, which he probably will.
Right.
That direction. Now,
September.
Crawford is coming up several weight classes.
Right.
We can certainly counter his point with the fact that maybe that's not the toughest fight. I agree with you that everybody has wanted to see.
Oh, did we lose him?
I think we lost him. Can you hear us, Al?
Yeah, I can hear
there
you.
He is.
Okay. Yeah, we lost you there. You were saying,
His legacy, the question will be, how do people judge it based on the fact that they'll be able to look back and say, no Benavidez, but he did other big fighters. So that's what his counter would be.
I didn't catch all that, Al, but I'm going to ask you real quick again. If you answered it, my apologies. But what do you think? I mean, we have, there's a lot of recency that goes on with Canelo, about greatest Mexican fighter of all time and all that. But what do you think his legacy will be when we look back in 5 years and 10 years? Because, he did a lot of things that were different. He is accused of, avoiding some fighters. What do you think his legacy might be as we look at it through the lens of history?
Yeah, I think people will look at him as a iconic figure because he has been that, and as a really good fighter who got better as he kept fighting. I mean, he's improved almost all the way through, and only maybe now age and the fact that he's had so many fights could be diminishing parts of him a little bit, but he has gotten better and better and better as he's been a fighter, and he's fought a lot of tough fighters. There may be some that he didn't, but he's really has jumped in with a lot of people. But the and even I mean, when he went up to light heavyweight to face Bivol, people in boxing knew that was a tough fight, but people out that were casuals thought, oh, he's not fighting anybody. We don't know this Bivol guy. Well, that was good. He lost. But I think people will look at him as an iconic figure, a terrific fighter. The recency thing you talk about happens all the time in sports now, whether it's basketball, football, baseball, boxing, the new guy is always the greatest that's ever lived. And that's what they do. But I think he'll be looked at
the backup quarterback.
Positive way. Now, for Oscar De La Hoya, it's interesting just as a juxtaposition. One of the things that helps his legacy, and George alluded to it, is he literally fought everybody.
Yes.
Every human that he could fight at any weight class, going up, down, whatever. And early in his career, he was being criticized for fighting fighters that were coming up in weight, but then he rectified that. And will they look askance because Canelo didn't fight Benavidez? They might, but I think they'll look at him as an iconic fighter who was obviously very.
I think guys like Tyson, they and De La Hoya kind of spoiled us because they were seeking out the toughest competition early in their careers. And that's just something we certainly don't see anymore. Not
as much, although you do see it sometimes. Like Bam Rodriguez is a perfect example. Yeah. He has sought out everybody, right?
That's right.
It's not a
that's true.
Boxing, but example of somebody who said, "Yeah, I want to fight everybody."
Lomachenko too. Yeah.
And the weird thing is, I wrote something. I said, the only thing that I put it in one of my ring columns that the only thing he has to do to get in the Hall of Fame at this point is continue that pesky career that he now has to do. It's like he's almost stamped his ticket to the Hall of Fame at age 23, which is
amazing.
Yeah. And it might seem like hyperbole, but rarely do you see that these days.
That's true. So let's get to some of the I was reading something today where in some sad news, I don't know if you remember, I'm sure you remember this name, Al. Irish Teddy Mann. Do you remember him?
Wow.
Yeah. Well, he just passed away. Like I just read he just passed away like yesterday or something. But that just reminded me of some of the old fights you would call at ESPN. That I think the first time I ever heard your voice was John LeCicero and Caveman Lee. And that was that's got to be to this day one of the best fights you have ever seen, correct?
It was that fight was held in the 20 Grand showroom in Detroit in July with no air conditioning, right? And it's in Detroit, and it was oppressively hot. And we went there, and just being there, you were really, really hot. And can you imagine boxing in those conditions? And that fifth round, I think it was the fifth round. And I've done for years. I did a stage show. It's called a boxing party, and I showed that round or part of the round of Caveman Lee and John LeCicero. The crowd would look at it and go, "Oh my God!" They were astonished. It's one of the greatest rounds of boxing ever because, LeCicero or Caveman Lee battered LeCicero and knocked him down, and then LeCicero barely beat the count, and then landed something like 25 unanswered punches to Caveman Lee, and somehow that Lee came back and knocked him out. It was insane. So that was, that series, the ESPN Top Rank Boxing Series, which went from 1980 to about 1986, and I was there virtually the whole time. I got on late in 1980. Was an extraordinary journey and ride because we did almost 47 or 48 shows a year, which is insane, right? Top Rank did that. They promoted it and put it on. Nobody's done that. USA was that time for the most part, but it was a crazy time, and we flew all around the country in small towns and big towns, and it was like the circus coming to town. And most of the boxing was really good. You know, it was like good, really good AAA boxing, and it was great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, George.
That's something that's kind of missing too, that you bring that up. Or you know, I think everything is sort of centered today around the big fights. But you know, back in the day, you had these, I don't know if you want to call them medium fights,
Right.
just good fights, and you know, a lot of blood, and they got after it, but it was always consistent. You know, almost like every week or every other week, somebody was fighting.
Now they're not every week, but now the Showbox series, which had that on Showtime, went away, although they were more sporadic. But here's again where people have to, if you're going to be a boxing fan, you got to dig in a little bit, and you look at, for instance, DAZN has a lot of fights on it, right? And if you look at those cards, there are a lot of those kind of fights on it. And the WBC has now formed this tournament, which is going to start in April or so, with all young fighters that are going to be fighting in like 4 or 5 weight where they're going to be there. And you are right. There's a weekly thing where you can go find that, you know, that up and coming fighter mentality like that. There, you have to look for them. Most of them are on the undercard of these big fights, or some of them are, like I say, DAZN is the one platform at this point. I'm not because I'm involved in it, just because they're putting on more fights. You have to have DAZN to get it. But I think you are right. One of the pieces that's a little missing is a regular series, but that hasn't really been around for a long time, even though Showbox series was there until a couple of years ago, but it wasn't, and that was about 10 shows a year, which was good.
Yeah. So of your ESPN years, is there something in particular that stands out? Is there a fight that stands out to you?
Oh man, we did so many over that period of time. I mean, we had more of the personalities in a way, and the fighters that created all those fights. You know, whether it was from the, you know, you mentioned Irish Teddy Mann. I mean, you know, from Terrence Ali to Brett Summers to Bobby Ches, who was on in the early days. All the
Freddie
Roach and Tommy Cordova.
Tommy Cordova.
You know,
Albuquerque Kid, George.
Yeah. It was a series that, you know, there were at least 6 or 7 fights that I thought, oh my God, I'm never going to see another fight like this, you know, and it wasn't like every week perfect, of course, and whenever you're doing boxing, you're subject to looking at a card and thinking, oh, that's going to be good, and then it isn't great. But for the most part, there were wonderful moments, and we had, you know, fight. We had all these interesting fighters like Buck Smith. Remember Buck Smith?
I do.
A middle level fighter who was good. You know, he was about the top 10 he could get to, and he fought even one of the Bruce Mouse Strauss guys who fought, you know, 15 times a year, 20 times a year. He would get. I'll never forget this clip on YouTube of me doing an interview with him after an ESPN fight. And the first thing when I get to start to ask him, he said, well, I'm kind of mad at you. I said, why are you mad at me, Buck? He said, because we all played wiffle ball today and you struck me out, which is true. Fighter playing wiffle ball on the fight, but that's what
and mad about it.
Yeah, mad about it. Those are different times.
Yeah, they are different times. And it was very, you know, this series was very unique because it was, and there's a lot of folklore, you know, surrounding it because we went to so many crazy locations. You know, the cow patty place out in Gardnerville. You know, we did a fight on a battleship with Gillies in Texas. You name it, we were everywhere. Small towns, these small towns. I'll never forget going to Lake Charles, Louisiana for the first time, and Donald Curry was fighting down there, and it was a crazy night. And I met some of my best friends down there. Ended up buying land, having a place.
No kidding.
Because I was getting into riding then and everything. But it was just a unique series.
You went to you went to Showtime. HBO was this, you know, the big man on campus, as far as the sport was concerned. But you guys gave him hell all the time. What was the mentality at Showtime in that rivalry? I mean, there's always great rivalries in New York, but that certainly was one of them, HBO and Showtime.
Yeah, HBO got the head start on Showtime. They started doing boxing more, like boxing, a little bit earlier, and they were. It's almost like Kleenex and okay. Kleenex is a brand. What do we call it? We call it Kleenex, right?
Yeah.
Even though it's not a tissue, it's something else. And that's kind of what they ended up being able to do with premium sports. And it took a long time for Showtime to kind of start to turn things a little bit. When I got in 2004, it was definitely a time when Showtime was quite clear. The boxing was good. It was in between the Don King fight, which of course he had some very big fights on Showtime. Those were very big, and Showtime was always significant, even though HBO got a little bit more pub. But this was a period right between where Showtime was really trying to figure out what are they going to do, how are we going to proceed with boxing with different promoters and things. And gradually, from 2004, they were able to uptick it. And one of the big changes came when they got aligned with then Golden Boy, not before it was even PBC, and they figured out a way to make, and they signed Mayweather, and they started to turn the tide. And the fascinating thing is, at the end of the day, who lasted longer? It was Showtime. Now that doesn't mean they won the battle. There was a place for both of those networks. But it was a sense of competition, I guess. But honestly, our goal was to be relevant. Our goal at Showtime was to try to really do the best production. And the one thing I will push back on, and I'll push back until I'm 100 years old, people believe, and I'm just gonna, this is just me saying what I believe, and it might sound self-serving. I think we ended up at Showtime doing a spectacular production of boxing. We poured money into it. When Stephen Espinosa came to Showtime, they poured tons of money into it. I think those shows were good, and the only thing that bugs me is the perception that HBO's production was so much better than Showtime's, because I don't believe that. But yeah. I give HBO all its props. I had Mark Taffet, we're good pals, and I work with him a lot now. So I give them all their props, but I just think people have to be realistic about how they look at it. But listen, they both those premium channels during their time served boxing well in terms of the product they put out.
And it's really too bad that Showtime's time ended just a few years after HBO's, because they were the go-to at that point, right? It was a competition. I mean, I think it, like you said, Showtime probably started edging out HBO there the last few years in terms of quality and production and everything, right?
Right. It was a little bit of a shift in the dynamic, and those 4 years or so that Showtime had, 4 or 5 years after HBO went away. The interesting thing was, and I was a little surprised that they stopped at that moment. We kind of felt it was going to stop at some point, but they had such a good year. They had giant pay-per-view that year that I have to assume, made a lot of money for time, and I'm sure they did. But they didn't want to be in the combat sports business, Paramount, and that's really what it boils down to. So it wasn't even so much a reflection on the money part, but it is too bad, because there was a good roll going. There would have continued to be, some really good boxing, but life has all those twists and turns. What can you do?
Right. Okay. I know you got to go here soon, but I'm not going to let you go with asking you this question. You told me this a few years ago. I want to see if your answer is the same. What are the 2 best fights that you've ever covered?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm still going to stick, I think, to the best fight I ever announced was, although it's very hard to quantify, but in terms of what I saw, Castillo and Corrales, their first fight, Diego Corrales and Luis Castillo, because it was 9.5 rounds of unmitigated action and astonishing skill, right? I think you guys probably would have. It wasn't just for instance, I love Gaddy Ford, and it was a really good fight, and there was skill involved, but it wasn't as skillfully fought as, quite, even though it's wildly exciting, great. This fight had skill and astonishing excitement and a twist at the end, which was amazing when Corrales got knocked down and somehow he came back to beat Castillo. And then the other fight I had to say, because even though it lasted, it's 1/3 of the time of that, I just don't know what compares to Hagler-Hearn and the first round. And the only reason I have to put it in there as the best fight is because of what was at stake and because of what we saw in that first and second round between those two men. I never forget being at ringside, and that was early in my career. I had been only a broadcaster for 5 years, and here I am on this pay-per-view. Kurt Gowdy is the host, and Al Michaels, my play guy, with me, and I'm looking around. How the hell did I don't even know why I'm. I'm like, hey, this is great. And I'd done Duran and Hagler before that in '83, but still, I was like, hey, this is pretty extraordinary. And it was, so I have to put that there for those reasons. Obviously, I've done many that were very exciting.
I have a quote here from your book that said, "The atmosphere was electric. I took off the headset for a second around and drank in the atmosphere. I thought about how lucky I was sitting in that seat."
Yeah,
that's pretty much describes it, right?
Yeah, and I also put in there that I try to do that now almost every boxing match I do. I take the headsets off just when they're starting to announce it. I want to feel what's happening. Now, obviously, not every atmosphere is like that. But yeah, that it was a very special night, and I when you have nights like that, you want to just keep that moment with you in every way you possibly can. But Gary Shandling had a good friend of mine who unfortunately has passed away, and he told me something hysterical. He said he was opening for Joan Rivers at Caesar's Palace, which was right next to where the fight was in the parking lot, but he's a big boxing guy. He owned a gym with Peter Berg, and he loves boxing. Big fan. He was at the fight, but he only had a certain amount of time before he had to run back to open for Joan Rivers. And he said to me, he said, that's the perfect fight in boxing history. Not because it was great, but because I only had 5 minutes to get back in time. So it was the perfect fight because it only went 3 minutes. So,
that's a true sports writer's mentality there, right? That's almost a sports writer's mentality, right? The better the game, the quicker the game is, the better it is.
You guys get your deadline made.
That's right. That's right.
Absolutely.
And Al, also, I know we didn't have time to talk about it because you've done so much, but you're also a very accomplished singer. When's your next gig? How's that going?
Ask because I don't know when you're posting this, but I be doing a show at the Casino in Las Vegas on Thursday, January 30th, and it will. I like to do them before fight weekends here in Las Vegas. I've done that since the first one I ever did was Hagler Leonard. Before that, at Caesar's House, and I'm going to do one at the Casino on Thursday, January 30th, which is a few days before the Benavidez Morel fight. Got on the line to talk to you guys. I was finishing up my set list for the two sets I'm going to do there. So if fans want to come out, if they come in town and they want to come out, it's no cover charge. Just come over to the Tuscany Hotel and have a fun night.
One of these days, I'm going to catch you, Al.
You got to come by. I know.
Yeah.
Come by. We talk a lot of music, and then I always throw in one segment of boxing trivia to give some prizes away and everything, because I know people always want to talk boxing anyway. This way I'll just give them a segment of boxing around it. When I did the show at Caesars, I would literally be in the middle of a song and some guy would come to the side of the stage and talking about boxing, and I'm like literally in the middle of singing, and I'm like, and then I just stopped. I said, if you give me 2 minutes to finish the song,
He desperately needed that answer to who won the first round of Hagler Hearns right now. He needed it right now.
I was in the Wacky tune, and he wanted to know about that. So it's fun. I mean, I know, and then I started more and more incorporating some of that stuff in it so that people could do that too.
Mm-hmm. That's good. That's awesome.
Well, Al, thank you. As always, it's a pleasure, and we hope to see you again real soon.
Yeah, let me tell you something. The two of you are great examples of wonderful, wonderful boxing writers who have chronicled the sport, and for many years in different markets and different places, each of you, given boxing fans a great view of the sport and have written about it fairly and well. Both of you guys are superb journalists, so I'm more than delighted to sit in with you guys.
I appreciate that, Al. That's very kind of you to say so.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Al. That's coming from you. That's a huge compliment. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, you guys are great, and I appreciate it. I love, I started out my career as a newspaper man a million years ago.
That's true.
So I appreciate what's done by people that cover the sport.
I used to read your column in KO magazine.
Oh yeah, that's right. That that's way back in the early '80s.
Yeah.
I was still working in Chicago doing newspaper, and I was freelancing in boxing, trying to get a foothold to be involved in it. So it was fun. And now it's funny how it comes full circle. Now I'm writing this Ring magazine column along with my broadcasting duties. So come around.
That's awesome. Well, look forward to reading you.
All right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks, Al.